Nick Vince here. Today on the Chattering Hour, I'm joined by our very special Christmas guest, Mr. Chris Sarandon, a man with almost 200 acting credits to his name and nominations for both Golden Globe and Oscar. We talk about his roles in Dog Day Afternoon, Child's Play, Fright Night, and of course, Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas. Up next today on the Chattering Hour, Mr. Chris Sarandon, right after this. And we're back with our special guest, Chris Sarandon. The 1993 film The Nightmare Before Christmas is a favourite of people looking for Halloween films and Christmas films, and his character of Jack Skellington appears on coffee mugs, t-shirts, and tattooed on people's arms and legs. In addition, he plays a wonderful vampire in Tom Holland's Fright Night, and a detective in our favourite killer doll film, Child's Play. Let's get to it. Chris, thank you so much indeed for joining me here
Oh, my
today.
pleasure, Nick. My pleasure.
Good. So I'd like to take you right back to your very beginning, basically, because you were born in Beckley, West Virginia.
Correct. Correct.
What was it like growing up there?
It was very small town America in one respect, in that when I grew up, my mom would open the door in the morning if it was not a school day, and we would go out, and at 5 o'clock, I'd hear my mother blowing a whistle on the little back porch off our kitchen, and that's when I'd come home. And the rest of the day, I was either walking down to my friend Phil's house or my friend Mike's house, and we'd play all day. It was a very rarefied and impossible to conceive of upbringing when you think of it now in terms of, just how fraught the idea of leaving our children alone to play with them, with their friends out in the streets alone for however long they wanted to. It was a town of 18,000 people.
Right.
But the distinguishing factor was that it was a coal mining town, in that it was the center of a region where there were lots of bituminous coal. Bituminous is soft coal.
Right.
And it was the center of that region, and it was also the county seat. So the city or the town was an interesting mix of small town America, but also it had a kind of feel of, it's hard to describe. My father owned a restaurant.
Right.
So I was exposed from the time I was very young to coal miners, to rural Appalachia on the one hand, but also the town was the county seat. So there were a lot of lawyers. There were a couple of hospitals there. So there were doctors. So there was a major kind of cross section of people that I was exposed to growing up. So it was not cosmopolitan. It wasn't sophisticated on the one hand, but there were pockets of it on the other hand.
Right. So
and my family were both immigrants. My dad was an immigrant from a small Greek village in Turkey.
Right.
And my mother's family were all from the islands, the Greek islands. So I grew up a kind of stranger in a strange land in a way, in that my parents spoke Greek at home. And in the restaurant, we were all Americans. My dad was part of the community. He spoke with a very thick accent, but he was he was in the Elks Club and this thing and that's, it was an interesting kind of conglomeration of growing up.
Right. So when did the acting bug take hold then?
The bug happened in college. Before that, I was always And I think part of it, I'm writing a memoir, so that I'm dealing with this, what's the genesis of all this? And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that I was trying to belong. And at the same time, I knew I didn't belong because my parents were aliens, quote unquote.
Mhm.
Uh, and they were citizens. Obviously, my mother was born here, but her parents, she didn't speak English until she went to school. She grew up in a very uh, intensely kind of ghettoized Greek community in a small town in Florida. So she was a product of a very strict Greek upbringing. And my dad came from the old country and was naturalized. So, and when my parents would speak Greek in public, I was sort of torn between, I knew what I, who I was on the one hand, but on the other hand, I was trying to separate from it because I wanted to be an all-American kid, just like all the other kids. There was nobody like me. So I think as a kind of defense mechanism, I listened a lot and I had a good ear for accents and dialects, and I told jokes and I read aloud in school because I was good at that. So that was the kind of, I guess, genesis of it, that shape shifting that you have to do to belong. And then when I got to college, I worked very hard to be popular. And so I got involved in politics when I was in college, and I was going to run for student body president, and I was running this committee and that committee. And then I had an opening in one of my class schedules, and I decided to take an acting class. And the professor, God bless him, Chuck Neal was his name, and he has since passed away. He invited me to be in a play. And he said, it's a small part. You won't lose time on all the committees that you belong to. Don't worry, and it was something where, you got to wear a toga. So, the kid in me went, oh, great. I get to play like I'm a Roman. It was a production of Julius Caesar. And that occurred. And then he offered me a lead in a play, a production of a play called Tartuffe, which is a Moliere comedy of manners and very satiric about society. And I didn't know whether I should do it or not. And I realized that not only did I get to wear a fake nose, but the woman who was playing opposite me was a former Miss West Virginia. And so I thought, well, come on, I can't lose. And so I decided to do that because I had a little time in my schedule, and that was it. I completely dropped everything. I recused myself from all the committee work that I was doing, and I left. I was in a fraternity, and I was living in the fraternity house. I moved out. I moved in with a grandma of a friend of mine in an apartment. I had one room, and she had another room. We shared the kitchen, and I became a theater wonk nerd. I was in every play that I could be in. I was smitten.
Wow. So how old was that when you were playing Julius Caesar then? How old when you got that?
Oh, I wasn't playing Julius Caesar. I was
Sorry,
playing like a
in
minor
Julius Caesar.
character called Flavius or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
I guess I was 19, 20.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Because you ended up with a master's degree in theatre, is that right?
Yes, I ended up after West Virginia, which didn't have a formal theater program. I ended up going to one of the three Master of Fine Arts schools in the States. At the time, there were only three of them: Yale, Carnegie Tech, and Catholic University. I couldn't get into Yale or Carnegie Tech because I didn't have enough of a theater background.
Right.
And so I got into Catholic U, which was these kismet, what do you want to call it?
Fate.
It was the perfect choice for me because
Right.
they had a professional theater program where they had a touring company, and I toured my second year of graduate school. I was out on the road for 8 months doing one-nighters of Romeo and Juliet and another Moliere play called The Miser. And we 2 station wagons and a truck, 15 students, and we traveled all over from east of the Rockies, um, 35,000 miles of one-nighters. And we did the sets. I was the lighting director and also the truck driver and played Romeo. It was the experience of a lifetime.
Wow. And this led on to doing Rose Tattoo?
Yes, that was there. And they had a professional summer theater program through Actors Equity, which is I know there's British Equity as well, but
Yeah.
this is the theater union. And I was the driver. I ferried all the professional actors around, and then they let me play parts of the young guys in the plays. And that's how I got my equity card. And I got to work with Olympia Dukakis in the Rose Tattoo. That was my first show. I played the young kid in that show. And of course they bleached my hair blonde because I was the only, no, I'm sorry. One other person, the guy who was playing the male lead was Italian. And I am dark-haired Greek kid with the, sort of darkish complexion. And they bleached my hair blonde so that I could play this young American sailor in the play. And I got like 3 or 4 parts in that play and worked with these amazing, Roy Scheider was in the company that year, and like an actor by the name of George Grisard, John Colicos, the great Canadian classical actor. And that was the sort of the beginning of my professional theater road.
Right. Right. So how did you make the move from theater into TV?
Actually, it was almost sort of straight from theater into movies because, yeah, right after graduate school, I did a year of improv theater, and also to make money, I was working with a small theater company in Washington, D.C., while my former wife, Susan, was still in school. She was a senior in school, and I had graduated. So I was doing improv at night. And then during the day, we toured Washington, D.C. public schools, doing little one-act plays that we also did improvisation with the kids in the plays.
Right.
And another extraordinary experience, because doing improv is such great training ground for any kind of work. And then I auditioned for something called the TCG, which is the Theater Communications Group, which is the loosely affiliated group of regional theaters all over the country in the United States. And I got hired to work at a theater in New Haven, Connecticut, which is about an hour and a half from New York City. And so I was in the company there for a year. And then just literally serendipitously, the guy who was running the theater agent came to see one of the shows that I was in and said, you should come in and audition for all the agents at the agency. And I needed a scene partner. And so Susan, my ex, and I worked up a couple of scenes, and I brought my guitar and I sang a song, and she and I read a couple of scenes, and literally like that, they signed us both. And this was with an agency at the time, which was like what is currently CAA. It was called CMA. And it was one of the biggest agencies in the world. And here we were, I just out of school. So it's a little mind blowing when you think about it, because all of these occurrences kind of came together to create this opportunity. And there I was. And the first job I had, you're right, was on a soap opera.
Right.
In the States called The Guiding Light. And I had a very small role. Basically, all I did was when the surgeons would come through the room where all the doctors were scrubbing, washing their hands, prepare for surgery, I would be the one who was scrubbing as the lead actor came through, and I would go, "Good morning, doctor." And he would say, "Good morning, doctor." That was basically my line for 6 months or 8 months or whatever the period of time was that I was on the show.
Right.
But I made enough to pay rent on an apartment in New York, which was at the time relatively inexpensive, $275 a month. And And then Susan got a job on a soap opera. And then I got a job as a replacement in a Broadway show, a lead in a Broadway show called The Two Gentlemen of Verona, which was the musical version of
Yeah.
Two Gentlemen, replacing Raul Julia. And I did that show for like 9 months a year. And that was, so it was from the beginning anyway, in terms of my professional career. I did started in theater, but then it became a mix of theater, TV, and then Dog Day Afternoon happened.
Which, of course, I'm just fascinated by Dog Day Afternoon. Was this just an audition?
Yeah, actually, it was. I knew tangentially, I knew Sidney Lumet because by that time Susan had done a film with Sidney. So
Right.
I knew him just sort of, socially. And I also knew Al Pacino because I had worked with his girlfriend, Jill Clayburgh, um, in a production of a Broadway musical called The Rothschilds. And and so when I went into the audition, there were kind of familiar faces. I wasn't terribly nervous. And Al Pacino was there and Sidney was there. Um, and it was also interesting because when I arrived for the audition room was filled with guys dressed in drag. And there I was, and I thought, oh, what did I did something wrong because I arrived in a sweater and a pair of jeans. And I thought, oh, I've really screwed it up. I didn't know that because I knew about the character.
Mm.
The character was someone who was a potentially a transgender in transition.
Mm.
And I walked in and I had a very, very strong sense that I knew this character. I don't know why. Um, I had worked with a number of gay actors in my theater career in New York. Uh, and that was a kind of, I don't know, a kind of prepping ground. But I also had this feeling about this human being who was trapped in the wrong psyche. And in a way, it was easy for me to identify because I grew up that way, of feeling an alien, if not in body, in mind. And so I did the audition, and Sidney Lumet said something really brilliant to me. He said, a little less Blanche Dubois, a little more Queens housewife. Queens is one of the parts of New York City that,
Yeah, yeah.
one
One
of
of the
the,
boroughs.
yeah. And so I came back and I read again, and that was it. I was hired.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, for those viewers who don't know, Dog Day Afternoon is based on real televised experience.
Yes.
Do you remember watching that when it happened, or was that just something you're
I
vaguely aware of?
remember
And you,
I remember when it occurred, and at the time it was more a matter of its being you get up in the morning and you pick up the paper on your way to, you're on the subway on your way to the theater, and it was front page news that this guy had uh, attempted to rob the bank. He was trapped in the bank with hostages. And then they discovered that the reason he had robbed the bank was to pay for his wife, quote unquote, because they were actually married by a priest,
Mhm,
in to buy to have enough money for a sex change operation.
right.
So it was sensational, but it didn't, it didn't go, oh my God, I want to be there. I want to do this, whatever,
Mm,
if this ultimately becomes something, the thought didn't occur to me.
right.
And it was some years later. I think it was a couple of years later, several years later,
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
before
I think it's
the
about 4 or 5.
screen adaptation.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think it's about,
but it was big news in New York.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So, and I have to say, I watched it again this morning, funnily
Oh
enough,
wow.
and I've not seen it. My memory is it came out in 75. I probably watched it 76, 77 on television. I don't
Mhm.
remember seeing, I definitely didn't go to cinema.
No, yeah.
And I just remember, firstly, I remember your character so clearly, partly because of the hair.
Taken from the photographs of the actual character.
Right. Right. And again, just watching it again, and I will talk about the performance in a moment, it's all those details you suddenly notice. The beautifully manicured nails with
Yeah.
was this part of your process? You've talked about the alienation and finding that deep inside, but was that costume and makeup who made those decisions, or was that?
No, actually, we had a wealth of, because it was a real life event, we had a
Mm,
wealth of material to draw from. And one of the photographs, the one that influenced me the most in terms of the look, was a picture of Ernie Aaron, the guy's real name. In the movie, he's Leon Shermer.
mhm.
But Ernie arriving at the scene, clutching that robe, that ubiquitous hospital, seersucker robe, whatever you want to call it, with the teased hair and the plucked eyebrows, and that was it. That's all you need.
Yeah,
And it's there. It's
yeah,
not as if you have to make it up. It's there.
right. And how
So
much?
I stole everything. Yeah,
Well,
that's
you know,
right. Steal from the best,
yeah,
as they
absolutely,
right.
absolutely. Now, how much of it was again watching it today? It's very clear that it feels improvised, but I was wondering how much improvisation there was, and did you actually improvise the last phone call that they have but you
There
have
was
with
a
Al
sort of
Pacino?
combination of that. I know that the original script was brilliant. In fact, the movie was nominated, I think, for like 7 Academy Awards. But
Mm,
the one that won was for the screenplay, and rightfully so, I think.
mhm.
Uh, Frank Pearson's screenplay was just so extraordinary. Um, but the phone scene, when we did a real kind of concentrated rehearsal segment, because Sidney came from the theater originally, Sidney Lumet,
Yes.
and he was very much of the belief that he always shot. He knew exactly what he was shooting. He had the movie basically cut in his head very often, and didn't waste any time, didn't waste any shots. We seldom did more than 1 or 2 takes in the entire film, at least the scenes that I was in. And I know Sidney was kind of famous for that. But he was very open to the moment. And when Al Pacino and I first read the phone scenes, it rang oddly melodramatic. It started with an argument. As soon as the phone, Leon picked up the phone and he
Mm,
started talking to Sonny, they were yelling at each other. And we both felt that the real life situation is that these are 2 people who have been through hell together. And the situation is melodramatic. Uh, Leon has just been in the hospital after overdosing. Al is in a bank with hostages. There are hundreds of people on the streets. There are police helicopters flying around. I mean, it's a highly fraught situation that, just in terms of tone and giving yourself someplace to go, you don't start at the top. You need to first establish that these characters are familiar with each other.
mm.
So it's not a matter of screaming at each other. It's more like, "Hi, how you doing? What's going on? I don't know. What's happening with you?" It's very mundane and everyday. And then the events that are laid out in the written scene will reveal themselves. And so we started just kind of riffing. Al and I did, and as we were doing it, we were incorporating everything that Frank Pearson had written into the scene, but we were doing it in a kind of organic way. And when we finished, we talked about it a little bit, and Sidney said, "Oh, all right, let's do it again." And he said, "Wait," and he had somebody, and I can't remember whether they taped it. I think they did. We did it again, and then we talked about it again, because we realized, oh, we left this out. This is important. We need to get to this point in the scene. We were constructing it, but in an improvisational way.
Mhm.
And then we did maybe 4 or 5 of them, in which they were transcribed. Then Sidney said, "Great. And we stopped rehearsing it. And a couple of nights later, as I recall, we sat in Marty Bregman, who was then the producer and also Al's manager, I think. We sat in his office with Sidney, with Frank Pearson, with Marty Elfan, the other producer, and we talked about each version of the scene that we had then, Sidney had them transcribed, and then we agreed on a version. And from that point on, in the scheduling of the movie, I didn't come to work for a while. And actually my first scene was the entrance where Leon's brought from the hospital and goes into the barbershop. And so I would go over to Al's house when he had some time off, and we would, his apartment, and we would run it. And we would say, oh, well, let's try it this way. Let's try it this way. And basically we were just kind of keeping it fresh, so that on the day when he shot his, I was on the phone with him, and we had a set version that came out of the improvisation. And then he was on the phone for me when I was in the barbershop. And we basically, it was, you know, then it had become a theater piece that was filmed in a way.
Wow, extraordinary. So you had a practical phone so you could hear his voice.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. We did. We were on the line for each other in both versions.
I've not heard of that. I guess it may often be done. I know people often read from behind camera.
Yeah.
But to actually have, which kind of speaks to the intimacy you were talking about, stealing from the best. I have to say, if I ever need to steal the moment when a relationship kind of ends, it's the last 3 or 4 lines.
Yeah.
It's because it's just that kind of like, we've done all the emotion.
Right.
Oh, how do we actually physically end
right. How
this?
do you, what's the template for this? There is none.
Yeah, precisely. And it's incredibly moving. Very, very moving.
Oh, great. Thank you.
That's now, obviously, you were nominated for at least 3 awards. But, and you mentioned that the film itself, I mean, I think Al Pacino was up for Best Actor
Al was
as well.
nominated. I don't know if John Cazale was nominated, either he or Charlie Durning. I'm not sure which.
I think they were both nominated, but for Globes possibly rather than Oscars.
Okay.
What was I mean, it's possibly a bit of memory, but what was the experience of not winning the award? Because there was so much buzz.
It was not bitter, first of all. By then I had separated from my wife, but at the same time she had rather humorously insisted that she get to go to the Oscars with me. And at the time I was unattached, and we were separated and amicably separated. So I said, yeah, sure, let's go together. And first of all, I think it was clear, just, you have this feeling. It was George Burns' year. George Burns had been kind of absent from the entertainment scene for some time. This was a kind of quote unquote comeback for him. He was much loved in the community, and rightfully so. And so it seemed to be a fait accompli that he was going to win. So I didn't feel any pressure. I just thought, let's just have a good time.
Right.
So we also decided that rather than going in a stretch limousine that the studio, that Warner Brothers had furnished, that we just said, look, give us the driver. We want to bring our own vehicle. And we rented a little Nash Rambler, a little sort of, it looked like a Pillsbury Doughboy. I don't know if you're familiar with Pillsbury Doughboys, but it was a little white kind of chunky little box and so we had this liveried driver, dressed to the nines, and I'm in my tux and Susan's in her gown, and we arrive in this little kind of putt-putt car. And it was all really about, let's don't take this too seriously. Let's just have a good time. And we get out of the car, and we start up at the time, the red carpet was kind of different then. It was kind of a long kind of runway, and there were stands on either side, grandstands on either side, and fans would sit in the grandstands and yell. And then there was a guy named Army Archard, who used to write a column in Variety and was very, very famous as a Variety columnist. And he was the host, and he was kind of at the top of a sort of parapet. Uh, and um, and so as we're walking, he's interviewing somebody, and whoever's running this thing pulls me aside and says, "Okay, you're next to go up and talk to Army. He wants to talk to you." And as I'm walking up the steps, I'm hearing, "Chris, Chris," and the crowd is screaming and yelling, and I'm going, "Whoa, hey, this is Hollywood. Hey." I've arrived. And I get to the top, and I'm starting to talk to Army Archer, and he's asking me questions, and I'm going, "Well, Army, um, when you're in the work and I'm doing all the things that I swore I wouldn't do, which is take it very seriously, take myself very seriously." And I'm just chattering away like the learned, extraordinary, experienced actor. It's my first movie, for God's sake, right? And I'm just rattling away, and they're screaming, the crowd's screaming, and there's all this noise. And I realized they're not screaming for me now. It's the next person on the totem pole who's coming up the steps. It's Sylvester Stallone, right? And I'm thinking they're going, "Chris, Chris." No, they're going, "Sly, Sly." And that's the moment that put it in perspective. That's what this is. Enjoy it. I went down the steps chastened, I must say. We went in, we had a great time, enjoyed the evening, and that was it. I have a
Wow.
plaque.
And then back to the day job and so.
Yeah, right. Looking for work.
Yes, yes, yeah. Which you obviously found. You had a very long, successful career. And I just wanted to pick out a few of those, if I may, that are related to the horror genre.
Sure.
In 1977, you did a Michael Winner horror film, The Sentinel, which had Burgess Meredith, Eli Wallach, Christopher Walken, John Carradine, Merlin Balsam. How was that experience?
Ava Gardner.
Yes, Ava Gardner. Yes.
Yeah, Jose Ferrer was in that. Arthur Kennedy was in it. God. Well, first of all, I must preface this by saying that there are times in one's life when one makes decisions based on the desire to create art, great art. This was not one of them. I was I was given, billing. I was given a lot of money. All the things that I swore I wouldn't do, I did. And it turned out to me personally to be a disaster. Michael Winner, God rest his soul, was very, very, I want to think of a kind way to put it, but I won't. He was not a nice man, and he was one of those people who, when he thought there was a chink in one's armor, would go for that chink and would try to create a situation in which he became the master of the situation. And the work atmosphere was not pleasant. He was a very, very autocratic on the one hand, and at the same time, cruel at times, not to me, but there were times when, for instance, he, instead of having the makeup FX people create freakish characters, he put an ad in the paper, or had an ad put in the paper, for people with real deformities, and then had them on camera. And during this filming of the scenes, when we weren't filming, you could hear him making wisecracks about them. It was a toxic environment. It was not fun. And it's one of the few films that I look back on and say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I did that, both for my personal growth and my emotional health, and also for what it represented. It was just not, it was not pleasant. I know there are fans of the movie out there, and I don't want to spoil your experience, but at the same time, for me, it was a disaster.
Right.
Only time I've ever said that. I've been in movies that have been bombs, but I've always found something to come out of it and say, you know what, I'm glad I did this.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a good friend of mine, Barbie, who worked on Death Wish 3
Ah, yeah,
with him. And she only had a small part. And
yeah.
just, it was the things that he said to her and tried to get her to do that weren't in the
Oh,
contract, and that
oh, I'm sure.
just not a nice man at all.
No,
And
no,
you
no,
think,
no.
how come he just kept on making movie after movie after
Well,
movie?
because, and he confided this to me. He said, the secret is to make your next deal before the movie you're working on comes out. So that way, if it's a disaster, you've already got your next job. And
Right,
that's the way he kept working.
right, right. Can you recall any other pieces of great advice? Well, I'm not saying that's
That's the
particularly a
only
piece of great advice, but
the only piece of advice I ever got from it.
right. What about any particular piece of advice that you've received? Because you've worked with some extraordinary people. Anything that springs to mind in terms of advice that you received?
Oh gosh. Um, I think it's not necessarily a single piece of advice as much as the experience that I had from the beginning was, first of all, it was from the theater. And so the actors that I first started working with as a professional were all pros. They were people who took the work seriously. The work had nothing to do with celebrity. It had nothing to do with becoming famous. It was all about the process. And so that always was paramount to me in whatever I was doing was, what's the process? Has the process been successful? Has it not been successful? And if it has been, then that's what I consider to be a success. If the process wasn't, then, as the case with the Sentinel, then this was a failure, even though the movie made a lot of money. That I cannot base my sense of accomplishment on financial success. It has to be on the work itself, and whether it's fulfilling in some way, or if I've learned something, or if I've come out of it a better person in some way, then that's what I'm looking for.
Right, right. Because you went on to work with, after that, you went on to work with Sean Connery a couple of
Worked with Sean a
times.
couple of times, actually. Yeah,
Yes. How
yeah.
was that? How was working with Mr.
Uh,
Connery?
yeah, Sean was a unique character. He really was. I mean, and in the sense of being he was in some ways very eccentric, and not in a destructive way, but he was easy to enjoy
Right,
because he enjoyed himself and he enjoyed other people. He was very easy to work with. He was a great scene partner. He liked to rehearse. He liked to analyze scenes. He was always accessible. We were on a location together in Spain for a movie called Cuba that Richard Lester directed.
right.
And Sean, when we'd go out at night, Sean was always with us. We'd go hang in, clubs around this very small town we were shooting in, a place called Jerez de la Frontera in southern Spain, in Andalusia. And Sean was always hanging out with us. And also, one of the things that I always appreciated about Sean was his there's no bullshit. He was very straightforward. He spoke his mind, and it wasn't about being a movie star. It was his natural inclination. I never had a sense that Sean was lording it over anybody because he was a big movie star, because he had done, I guess, a couple of Bond movies by then, or at least one or two. And then I did a movie called Just Cause with him that I was ultimately cut out of most of. Yeah. I had a couple of scenes with Cap Shaw and with Sean that ended up on the cutting room floor. But again, great experiences. I really enjoyed him and miss him. Yeah.
Right, right. And what about thinking about a director now? Another great director you worked with was Sam Peckinpah on the
Yeah.
Oscar
Right.
weekend.
Yeah.
What was that like?
That was the only time I have ever I've been hired for a movie sight unseen. That is, I'd get a script and it was an offer, which doesn't happen very often, by the way. Or you go in and you audition, or you meet and you talk, and then you come back and you meet again and you discuss. I walked into Sam's office the first time I met him. I sat down, we talked for literally 5 minutes about nothing. And he looked at me and he said, "Okay, you're hired." And I went, "Excuse me?" He said, yeah, you're hired. You're hired. Good to meet you. I'll see you on the set. And that was it.
For those of you who don't know, actors dream of moments like this.
Yeah, exactly. And working with him was very interesting. I know that we, at the time, his health was not good. This was his last film.
Right. Yes.
And so that from what I understand, the irascible, difficult genius was not always evident in my working with him, but it was interesting nonetheless, because I got a chance to be exposed to the great Sam Peckinpah.
Right.
And he was very genial and extraordinarily forthcoming, and he was great.
Okay. Good.
Yeah.
And then a little while after that, one of your first genre real big hits was Fright Night, directed by Tom Holland. Again, was that just another casting?
That was, I got the script, and that was an offer. That is, they sent me the script. Would you be interested in playing this role? And at the time, excuse me, and I've talked about this a number of times, that I had been kind of going back and forth between doing films and television specials.
Right.
And at the time, there was a special set of programs that were primarily on television. They were something called the Hallmark Hall of Fame, and they did classics. I did You Can't Go Home Again, which is an adaptation of a Thomas Wolfe novel, a great American novelist, with Lee Grant. And I did A Tale of Two Cities. Some interesting stories involved with that one as well. But that was a great experience. And that was a 3-hour special for American television, in which I played Sidney Carton and Charles Darnay both. And so I was kind of full of myself, quite frankly. I was a theater actor, and I had done these Hallmark Hall of Fames, and I'd been getting offers for some films, and Dino De Laurentiis, while we were doing Lipstick, had offered me a slate of pictures that I'd turned down all of them. That's another sort of, that'll be in the book. And so I got the script, and I looked at the title page, and it said Fright Night. And I went, oh, Jesus, I can't, I'm a very important actor. I do classical theater. I do classical television programs. I'm in demand. It's really the pain in the ass full of myself. And I can't do this, but at the same time, this is an offer, and I owe it to them to read it and then call back and tell them why I'm not doing it, right? Mm-hmm. So I sit down, and I have a very vivid memory. I had a big old roll top desk. The top slides up. I sat down on my roll top desk in our New York City apartment. This was during my second marriage. And I sat down, and I started reading the script, and within, I don't know, like 10 minutes, I was like, whoa, this is really freaking good. And by the time I finished the script, I said, I have to meet this guy. So I called my agent, and they set up a meeting. They flew me out to LA to meet Tom and Herb Jaffe, the producer. And we sat down, and after maybe 5 minutes of pleasantries, Tom said something like, I know I'm a first-time director, and he had a history in major motion pictures. He'd written a number of screenplays that had been produced, but this was his first directing job. And Tom said, this is how I see the film. And he started at the beginning, and he described every shot of the movie. And he just went through it. And by the time he finished this amazing presentation, I got up and I went, okay, where's the contract? Where do the cliche, where do I sign? And that was the beginning of an extraordinary, to me, collaboration with Tom. Tom had been an actor when he was younger. And so we had a couple of weeks of rehearsal. The first time since Sydney to Met that I'd had that kind of intense rehearsal period. We all did background books on our characters. We discussed the scenes, we rehearsed the scenes. Any suggestions that the actors had that Tom liked, he incorporated them into the script. It's interesting because we did recently a benefit Zoom, one of these virtual readings of Fright Night for the Michigan State Democratic Party. And John Stark, who played Billy, my sidekick in the movie, was the person who was collating the script. And he had a hell of a time because he realized that the printed script was totally different from the script that we shot, because there were so many adjustments that Tom made along the way based on the work that we did in rehearsal, which never happens. It happened in Dog Day. It happened in Fright Night, and it hasn't happened before or since for me in either.
Wow. What was it? Because you had some scenes with Rodney Mcdowell, did you?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
What was it like working with Rodney Mcdowell?
Roddy was such first of all, an extraordinary human being. He was a walking encyclopedia of Hollywood history. So regaling us with stories of, working on How Green Was My Valley, which is one of my all-time favorite movies when Roddy was a boy, through working with Liz Taylor and becoming her dear friend, and up through the Planet of the Apes films. And he had this extraordinary collection of films at his home. And coincidentally, my wife, Joanna Gleason, had worked with Roddy on a tour with Vincent Price and Coral Brown and Roddy, the three of them. And so she knew him well. So we became really close friends with Roddy, because we had by then moved to California. And this was post Fright Night. And we would often go to Roddy's house and sit with these famous dinners that Roddy would have, where you'd sit down and suddenly you'd be looking around the table at half the people that you'd grown up idolizing when you were watching films when you were a kid, or in your 20s or 30s. And he was an extraordinary fellow. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I miss him terribly.
Of course. And of course, I think the other highly successful collaboration you had with Tom Holland was with Child's Play.
Yes.
Again, did he just offer that one to you?
Tom wanted me to do it, but the studio did not want me to do it. They had a different idea about who this macho cop from Chicago should be. And Tom and I had such a great collaboration on Fright Night. And I think to a certain extent, he also wanted an ally, somebody who could, step up and go, hey guys, come on, back off, leave him alone.
Right.
Because it is by definition, I think, an antagonistic relationship, the artist and the people who bankroll the movies, by necessity. And that friction is good.
Yeah.
On the one hand, the people who are furnishing the money have a right to say, look, this is the time we have. This is the amount of money we have. You can't be profligate. You've got to be responsible. And on the other hand, the artist has the compulsion and the responsibility to say, this is my vision. Don't fuck with me. And Tom is not one to be a shrinking violet. when it comes to the studio, and he at times could be volatile, necessarily volatile, because sometimes it's necessary to have that kind of force up against these, these people who are basically bookkeepers at times. And so I think I was an ally in that regard, because I was the person who could go up to Tom and say, Tom, chill, okay? You want to stay on this movie. I want you to stay on this movie. Let's figure out a way to make this work. It didn't happen that often, but when it did, I was around. But Tom fought for me and cast me. They talked them into casting me.
Right. Did you find as I did, watching it recently, the doll just really disturbing, and
It's
whole
hard.
concept?
Yeah, I know. The concept is disturbing. Every child's nightmare that the child's toys will come alive and somehow be menacing and malevolent. It was difficult to think of it as being that kind of malevolent figure when you were constantly dealing with an animatronic Chucky, who was, you're standing on a fake floor and there are guys underneath it pulling wires and, moving the hands, and you're doing endless takes because an arm is not in the right position on one particular shot. I remember an excruciating series of nights in the freezing cold in Chicago, where I'm in the car and Chucky's trying to knife me. The knife is not glinting in the right way. The light's bouncing. It's bouncing into camera. It's flaring. So his knife is not in the right position. It's not fun shooting. And also because and I'm dating myself, but in those days, and it was the same for Fright Night as it was for Child's Play, that there was no CGI. That everything, all the visual stunts were practical. So everything had to be done in jerry-rigged ways, cutting things between little people in big sets as being Chucky, to the animatronic, to there's a guy in the back seat operating the knife. It's crazy. I sat one day for hours just with my hand grasping at the radio so that they would have cuts of my attempting to get help while Chucky's trying to knife me. It's crazy. It's crazy. It was fun in some respects, but it was the freezing cold Chicago, middle of the winter. I remember one scene where Catherine Hicks is leaving, I think it's a police station. I can't remember exactly what the scene is. And I'm supposed to try to stop her as she gets into a taxi cab or something. And I walk out the door, and the location was right on Lake Michigan, almost, adjacent to it, or the river, the Chicago River. And a blast of air comes off the lake just as I'm going to holler to her. And all I could do was go, because I couldn't speak. It was so friggin' cold. We should have gotten hardship pay.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, it was a tough shoot.
Right.
But fun. Looking back on it, I have stories.
Right.
Good stories. Yeah.
Good. Moving on a bit, then I'd like to talk about A Nightmare Before Christmas.
The Nightmare Before Christmas. Right?
Nightmare Before Christmas.
Or properly titled Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas.
Yeah. Yes. And of course, although Tim Burton was the originator of the idea and long story of getting the rights back from Disney, etc., it was actually directed by Henry Selick.
Correct.
Now, first thing, how were you brought onto that project?
That was an audition. Straight audition. The singing had been recorded by Danny Elfman. The songs had been, I believe they'd been animated by then, or at least partially animated. And there was a casting call.
Right.
I was in a room with a bunch of other people. We all went in. I believe we had storyboards, and I think we may have. I'm pretty sure we had, because they wanted a voice that matched Danny's voice, and just sheer luck, our voices were close enough together that they were able to cut them together. So they cast me.
Right.
That was it.
Was this your first voiceover work?
I'm trying to think if I'd done anything before this. I don't think so. I'd done a couple of things after.
Right.
I did a Miyazaki from the Japanese to English,
Right.
something called Nausicaa.
Yes.
And I'd done a low budget feature called The Chosen One, where I played an old an old geezer miner prospector. But no, that was it. That was the first one.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
What's now? I mean, the initial response to when it first came out wasn't that positive.
It's interesting because, as was the case with Fright Night, which was a moderate hit, but not a huge. It was like a summer horror vampire movie that got its audience and then kind of left the scene.
Mm-hmm.
And to a certain extent, Child's Play, although I think Child's Play was made a bit of a bigger splash.
Mm-hmm.
It was not a huge, like tentpole opening, a big opening movie that lasted forever. It was around. It got its critical kudos, but then it sort of left the scene. And actually the same with The Princess Bride.
Yes, of course.
Where they have moderate success when they first open, and then their cult status becomes almost legendary over time. And Nightmare has been the multi-generational response to that movie and The Princess Bride has just, I still wonder at it, and not because of the quality of the pictures, but just because of the enormity of their fan base.
Right. Right. We didn't really talk about Princess Bride. What's your favorite moment from working on Princess Bride?
I think just because it was my favorite scene, the scene with Chris Guest in the forest just before we go into the pit of despair, and I say, I have my wife to murder, my my country to the Florida to blame for it. I have a wedding to plan. I'm swamped. That was my favorite moment, just because the dialogue is so the rhythm of the speech is so perfect, and the tone is so quintessentially William Goldman, The Princess Bride. There are any number of lines like that in the movie that other characters have. Obviously, I think Wesley has a line that he says to Buttercup when she says it isn't fair, and he says life isn't fair. Anybody who's trying to tell you any different is selling something. It's that wonderful juxtaposition of situation and the clash of modern sensibility with the situation, which is ancient in a way. It's a genre kind of cliche, but it's the cliche is twisted. And thematically, it's interesting to me that a lot of that happens in Fright Night too, where Tom Holland, who had a great affection for the vampire genre and loved all the old vampire movies, but at the time that we made Fright Night, the vampire movies were had faded from the scene, and when they were made as spoofs, were camped up. Love at First Bite.
Yeah.
And Tom felt strongly about the genre, loved the genre, but felt that obviously it had to be updated in some way, so that but felt strongly that you don't make fun of it, you have fun with it. And that's what both, I think, Fright Night and The Princess Bride do, which is they create an atmosphere, they create a genre, and then they go, oh, let's just twist it a little. Let's make it a little more fun. Let's make it funny. Let's make it serious. Let's make it romantic. Let's make it sad.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary. I remember when I first watched Princess Bride, and there's that moment like, what am I watching?
Mm-hmm.
Just got to get my head around this. And there's like, and then you start listening to the dialogue, and it does sound like poetry.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily written in rhyming couplets or anything, but
Yeah.
just as you mentioned,
There's a
it's the
very
rhythm of it, the
profound
speech.
rhythm. Yeah, very
Yeah, yeah.
profound rhythm to it. And getting back to The Nightmare Before Christmas,
Mm,
I think that the wonderful thing about that movie is that, and in a way, it parallels oddly The Princess Bride in that it takes some of the tropes um, of um, of a character going through something and coming out at the other end, and everything is rosy and wonderful, but the journey was difficult. And I think that that's one of the reasons why the movie's had such an enduring life, is because I get a lot of young people or people in their 20s and 30s who come up to me at occasional conventions
mhm.
and will say, you don't know how much this movie has meant to me, because when I was a kid, I was very different. And I had no way of identifying with a culture.
Hmm.
And that movie let me into a way of looking at the world that was a little different, but that in which everything worked out okay. And at the time, I was struggling, and I didn't see possibilities in my life. Uh, that coupled with I'm trying to think of a word to describe the artistry of the animation,
Hmm.
and I can't. I'm speechless, because the stop motion animation in that movie, and that's Henry Selick
Hmm.
and his team, um, is to me otherworldly. You know, when you watch that movie, you completely get involved in the reality on the one hand, and you don't realize the painstaking work it took. They shot 11 seconds of usable sequence per week on 4 different sets or more. I don't know how many sets they were operating at one time. I saw maybe 3 or 4 when I was there. Uh, the work is so painstaking, and at the same time so detailed, and so it's to me it's a miracle. And I think that audience senses that when they
Hmm.
watch it, that even though they're caught up in the flow, I think they realize in some way this is an extraordinary artistic accomplishment, the visuals as well as the story.
Right, right. And I know you've maintained your relationship with the franchise. What's your favorite piece of, um, sorry, the word has just gone completely out of my merchandise.
Ah,
What's your favorite piece of Jack Skellington merchandise?
oh gosh. I mean, I have a few of them here in my office. You know, I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah,
Right there,
sure.
you see that casket in the background, and you open it up, and there's a life-size Jack in a Santa outfit. I mean, you know, it's endless. There are ashtrays, there are doorknobs, wrought of the finest brass with Jack's head on them. There are the merchandising geniuses, and I'll say that at Disney are,
Mhm.
they're amazing. They're amazing.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So I'm come to the end of our time together.
Oh no,
Or
no,
coming to
don't
the
say
end, and I'd just like to end with a few questions,
that. Sure.
which I call the luggage in the crypt. The idea being that, like the Egyptians, they had these wonderful places to go, which
Right.
wasn't the end. There was no idea that you got into the pyramid and that's where you were going to spend the rest of eternity. It's a
Eternity.
staging post,
Yeah.
but
Right.
you need things on your journey.
Yeah. Right.
So
You
if
gotta
I
have your
had,
gear.
say again,
You have to have your gear.
you have to have your gear.
Yeah.
What film would you take with you?
Well, first of all, the thought that somebody would build a pyramid in my honor is a little far fetched, but we're we're in genre land,
Yeah,
so you have to imagine.
yeah,
What would I bring with me?
yeah.
I would bring pictures of my children and my grandchildren. I have 9 grandchildren,
Wow.
and they're all extraordinary, extraordinary beings. They really are. Um, and I would ask to be sure that the love of my wife would be with me, because that would carry me a long way. And beyond that, I can't imagine anything else I'd need.
No book, no album, no piece of
Well, okay, okay, all
if
right.
I'm really
I
mean.
would take along with me copies of Blu-rays of Hobson's Choice. I don't know if you know that movie.
I do know that movie with
It's a
Charles
Carol Reed,
Lawton
Charles Lawton,
and the
John
moon in the
Mills,
puddle, arguing with the moon in the puddle. Yeah.
and yeah, and an extraordinary performance by a fabulous British actor named
John Mills?
no, the actress
Oh, sorry, the actress.
Barbara DeBanzi, I think is her name.
Right.
At any rate, there are 3 extraordinary performances in that movie,
Yeah.
and it's a Carol Reed movie. We just watched a Carol Reed movie last night, actually. Um, any movie by Michael Powell, the great, great Michael Powell, Red Shoes, Peeping Tom, You Can't Take It With You. Not You Can't Take It With You, but I know where I'm going.
Mm.
Nosferatu, just as a kind of reminder of where I came from in my movie life. How Green Was My Valley. And I think I'd take along, just because I hear this from so many people, that when they're down, and I'm sure in the afterlife that you've got to have a down day, a copy of The Princess Bride. And a wonderful, wonderful book called Winter's Tale by a writer named Mark Halperin. Halperin.
Yes.
It's a great book. And his Dark Materials, the Philip Pullman books, those are among my favorite all-time literary touchstones. You know those books? They're on now.
The BBC are just doing the TV, the film,
Yeah,
effectively
yeah.
the film
They're
series version.
in here, yeah, the version. Oh, there's so much. I can't, any John Ford movie, Shane, The Searchers, any I'm really into Michael Powell these days because I'm reading his autobiographies. They're 2 huge volumes.
Right.
And he talks a lot about Hitchcock and his association with people like him, and Lawrence of Arabia. I take that with me. This could take days. Move on. Move on.
Move on. Absolutely. You done. Do you listen to music much?
Yeah, I'm a big Baroque guy. I love Bach, Vivaldi, another period, but Mozart. I'm also a big fan of the Beatles. Who isn't? I listen to. I have very eclectic musical tastes.
Right.
So, my musical tastes go across so many different genres. I'm a big bluegrass guy because I grew up in West Virginia. And at the time, I felt, that it was hillbilly music, and I didn't want to be a country kid, thought of that way. And as I grew older, I realized the artistry and also the history that comes with it, because so much of that music came from Scotland and Ireland. And I had a course when, this is another story. Anyway, from bluegrass to Baroque. Let's put it that way.
That's a
And rock
good
and roll.
range.
And rock and roll. I was in a rock and roll band when I was in high school.
Ah,
Yeah,
singing? Oh, you mentioned you're singing,
I was
playing
a
guitar.
drummer. I was a drummer, and I also sang backup in the band. And I've done some Broadway musicals. So, yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Okay, and favorite food?
Oh, well, some of it comes from my background. I make a number of Greek recipes, and there's one that I love called Euvralakia, which my mother used to make all the time. And I made for my kids when they were little, and now they make for their kids. So recipes that have been passed down through the generations. They have a resonance that's above and beyond the taste of them. It's also about, where they came from. So, my kids still have recipes that I've given them from my mother, and her recipes came from her her antecedents in the Greek islands. So, yeah.
Wow. Okay, that's great choice. And what about a piece of visual art, a painting, a statue?
These days, among them, Guernica, I think, had a real impact on me when I was younger, and even now when I look at it, it evokes so much about uh, human the human capability for atrocity, but also the human capability for finding a way to express that kind of anguish in a way that has a lasting effect. Any painting by Vermeer, certain Rodin sculptures. This fills my head with with all sorts of thoughts. Yeah,
Right.
and great films.
Right.
I've gone over a number of them.
Yeah.
And they're still in my sarcophagus.
Right. Okay, fair enough. The one question you mentioned a couple of times that you're working on a biography at the moment. Have you got as far as finding a title for the book yet?
Yeah, it's called Heroes, Vampires, and Villains.
That's a great title.
Yeah, and my agent is we're sort of fighting through the traffic of what's going on with the pandemic, as is necessary right now. So there's not a lot going on in the literary world, but hopefully at some point in the near future, I'll have a publisher and we'll announce publication. Still working on it.
Right. Well, I'm sure it's going to be absolutely amazing and fascinating. And just from talking to you now, I know there are so many more stories. Chris, thank you so much for spending some time with me today.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure.
My thanks again to Chris Sarandon. What a fascinating and charming man he is. Join me next week for the last show of season 1 of The Chattering Hour, when Chris Rowe, our producer, joins me to discuss the origins of the show and our favourite moments from season 1. Until then, have a very safe and happy Christmas, and hopefully see you on December 31st.